prophecy update this week. Again, a very exciting week in the things that have been happening with Bible prophecy and the things that have been happening in the world. I want to put some things into context. I'm going to talk a little bit more next week about Hanukkah, and because there's been a very strange convergence of events in that Hanukkah this year fell on Thanksgiving. It's the first time it's happened in a very long time, and my understanding is I've heard two versions of when it will happen again. It won't happen again until the 22nd century, or it won't happen again for 70,000 years. Wow. So somebody's just a little bit off there on their estimates, but it's a very unusual event. It's things that a number of writers have taken note of, but I think that the Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah, was once something that Jesus celebrated. Talks about it in John chapter 10. We'll look at that next week. And we'll also put it in its historical context and how it is part of a prophetic pattern for the end times, what happened at the time of the original Feast of Dedication. Really not a good description of it, because it really was a feast of rededication of the temple at the time of the Maccabees at about 168 BC. 168 BC, when the area there was ruled by Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, however you want to say that, the Seleucid ruler. So we'll look at that, and a lot of that is going to be, what we're going to talk about today is a setup for that. But I want to cover a few things from a prophetic perspective, then we'll do the setup for Hanukkah, and we'll finish the teaching on Hanukkah next week, if we're still here. This is a chart that was prepared by, I talk a lot about the economic thing. We know that Bible prophecy, book of Revelation, tells us that at one point there will be tremendous economic upheaval. And as that economic upheaval happens, people will need to be prepared for that. One of the things that leads to that is the way government and business operate today. Our currency isn't really worth anything. It's not tied to anything of value. But this is what's happened with public welfare benefits. Now look, I'm not against public welfare, but the whole situation is out of control. And what you see here now is, this is a study done by the Pennsylvania Department of Secretary of Public Welfare in Pennsylvania. And what he did was he went through and he said, okay, what benefits does a single person getting welfare have if she gets all the benefits? He used a female as an example. If she gets all of the benefits, what would she have to earn in the private sector to make it worth her while to work? Okay? So you take all of her benefits, and this line, you see there's certain cliffs here? So this line here, the highest welfare cliff, is you get benefits worth about $58,000. So it says here, the single mom is better off earning gross income of $29,000 with $57,000 in net income and benefits than to earn a gross income of $69,000 with a net income and benefits of $57,000. So in other words, if she just worked a job and made $29,000 a year, she'd be better off than if she had a private job, didn't get any welfare benefits, and made almost $70,000. Do you understand how that skews things in the economy? And I know from working with some people that have contract employment agencies, there is, I've been told that when welfare benefit checks come out, they have trouble finding workers for a week or two until the welfare benefit check runs out, because people will just get the welfare check and won't show up for work for a couple weeks until either they go and gamble it away or drink it away or whatever, then they'll come back to work. But it's a huge problem in our society, and those benefits are not sustainable. And the fact that a lot of people think that they are, and a lot of people in our government think they are, or a lot of people in our government know better and don't say anything about it, unlike this gentleman in the state of Pennsylvania, is the beginning, I think, of what we see as the delusion of the end times. That delusion is going to operate on many different levels. It's not just going to be delusion about theology or the Bible or a great world leader. It's going to be economic, it's going to be political, it's going to be social, it's going to be religious. And as that delusion increases, it's going to be very disconcerting for people that are believers that we live in this time. This chart, also from the same report, shows that, for example, there are 109 million people employed in the private sector. Welfare recipients total 66 million. Government employees are 21 million. So that means that for every 1.65 persons employed in the private sector, one person receives welfare benefits. That's not a sustainable thing. And if you're working, it creates a disincentive to work because they keep taking more of your money. It also means that for every 1.25 persons employed in the private sector, you'll have one person either receiving welfare benefits or working for the government. Again, that's not to denigrate government workers, but that's just to show that we've reached an unsustainable thing in our culture, in our economy, that cannot be sustained, and eventually it has to collapse. When that happens is anybody's guess. It might be 3, 5, 6, 7 years. Japan has been moribund for over 20 years. And people short Japan bonds because they figure that the thing's going to collapse at some point. They may have to hold on to those things for 3 to 7 years. They may have a negative cost of carrying them for a while, but eventually I think they will find that what they think, that the Japanese economy will sink under the weight of its demographics. I think I've mentioned before, they sell more adult diapers in Japan now than baby diapers because the population is getting old. And there was a promise made, we've all bought into it, that you could retire at 65, but when they started doing that program, the average life expectancy was about 63 or 64 years in the United States. Now the life expectancy is up into the 80s, and there was a picture, I think, on one of the big magazines this week, maybe Time or something. Well, this kid showed a little Asian kid, baby. Well, this kid will live to be 120 on average. That is not sustainable. In fact, it goes beyond the biblical, what seems to be the biblical allowable life, 70 or 70 or 80 years, and people are living much longer than that, and science keeps trying to push it out even further, but people aren't working past 65, haven't been. So the whole thing doesn't work. And the fact that people think that it will continue to work is just, I believe, part of that end-time delusion that's going to operate and increasingly operate in our culture and society and economy. We'll look at the Middle East now. I remember many years ago, I had a conversation at dinner with Chuck Missler. And I said, Chuck, this is probably 5 years ago. I said, Chuck, what do you think? Are you excited yet? Do you think Jesus is coming soon? Do you think everything's going to wrap up? He goes, well, John, when I see Turkey start to flip the wrong way, away from the West, back towards their Islamic roots, then I'll get excited. Now, Turkey is a major problem. They are not a friend of us anymore. They're not a friend of Israel. They're flipping. So I don't know if Chuck is excited now or not. Could be. Syria. I mean, you aren't even hearing anything about Syria right now, but there continues to be a major fighting going on in Syria. In fact, this is the latest UN State Department report on Syrian refugees in the different countries. And you see here, for example, in Jordan, it says they have 543,000 refugees in Jordan. Now, Jordan is a country of about 4.5 million people. 543,000 refugees have come into that country. So over 10% of the country is now refugees, have no job, need support, need water, need food. And Jordan is, in case you haven't been there or looked at a map recently, Jordan is a desert. So just getting these people water takes hundreds of water trucks and sewage trucks every day. And some of these camps now, one of these camps has 250,000 people in it. It's crazy. And the Jordan government estimates that they really have over 600,000 people. Look over here at Lebanon. Now in Turkey, there's 504,000 known, but the government estimates that there's actually 660,000 Syrian refugees that have moved into Turkey. Causes tremendous economic, social, political, all kinds of problems. Over here in Lebanon, 790,000 is what the official statistics show, but the government of Lebanon estimates that it's actually more like 1.2 million people. And when you add up all the numbers of the refugees, the number is 2,175,000, but with the governments are estimating that it's over 3 million, and you add to that 4.25 million that are known to be internally displaced within Syria, you have a major problem on your hands. The governments of the world really don't know what to do with this. And then you add on top of that, the statistics I saw this week are the Central African Republic. That is a country of 4.5 million, 5 million, somewhere around there. Over 400,000 people are now refugees, internally displaced or have moved to other countries, about 10% of the country. Imagine what would happen in Columbus if suddenly 10% or over 10% of the people were homeless. With regard to Syria, though, when you add up the number, you come up to about 7.2 million out of a population of about 20 million, which means more than 1 in 3 people do not live in the same place that they did 2 years ago. That is a major humanitarian crisis that is on our hands there. The church. Paul Crouch, founder of TBN, passed away last night. TBN has been the source of many heretical teachings. There are some people on that network that have good shows. There's a lot of controversy, whether should I have a show on there, should I not have a show on there. I sometimes take the view that, well, at least something good is getting out there, but then when people go there, they find a lot of stuff that's not good. And Paul Crouch was one of the big proponents of the word faith heretical teaching. That if you just believe God and say the right thing and have faith, you'll be healed and you'll be wealthy. Well, he wasn't healed. He died the other day, 78 or 79 years old. He and his wife had not lived together for over 3 decades. Yet people go at this. In England, and I want to show you where some of this goes, ex-Archbishop Carey says that the church in England is on the breach of extinction. And you can see here that the Church of England is the blue at the bottom. No religion is the orange at the top. And you can see that since 1900 to 1985, and the number continues to go down, the Church of England is essentially disappearing. More mosques have been built in England in the last 20 years than churches, which sort of refutes the prophecy that was promoted by John Wimber and the Kansas City prophets that England was, back around 1991, that England was going to undergo a great revival and turn into a Christian nation. Those were false prophets. John Wimber, the founder of the Vineyard, and the Kansas City prophets were false prophets. More mosques built in England than churches in that period of time. Their prophecy did not come true. So the church is on the brink of extinction, and then a judge comes out in England and says, well, we need more laws. We've had 3,000 new laws enacted in the last number of years in England because we need more laws, because without that moral foundation provided by the church and religion, people don't know how to behave. So we have to put more laws on them. That costs more to support government, police, and that type of thing. But that lack of biblical-based thinking has consequences. Here's an editorial from Peter Osborne talking about the Iranian peace agreement. And I'm going to focus on that now because I think it brings a lot of things into focus from a Bible prophecy standpoint, a lot of significant things happening with regard to the world abandoning Israel. And here's a man in England who doesn't think Israel has any biblical significance. It's not biblically important. And he says the ill-informed friends of Israel who are refusing to face facts are causing major problems in the world. And he says this, talking about Obama. His new understanding with Iran, for example, can open many doors. No settlement is possible in Syria without Tehran's assent, nor can America and Britain withdraw peacefully from Afghanistan without an agreement with Iran. It is not absurd to speculate that Kerry and Obama will soon press for the prize that has eluded every president so far, a lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you are seeing this huge push from the major nations of the world, our own government pushing Israel to give up land for peace. And I believe that I could show to you in Ezekiel 35 through 37 where a temporary peace agreement may in fact be in the offing. I don't want to be dogmatic about it, but I think it's there. It talks about giving up the mountains of Israel, the biblical heartland, Judea and Samaria, the exact area that the Palestinians want, the area known as the West Bank. But you'll note that there's this belief now that unless Iran is involved, unless we make peace and nice with Iran, we're not going to be able to have any kind of peace or control in the Middle East. This article from the, I think, Washington Post, this griffin, lion-like creature, was returned to Iran as a gesture over the last several months to get them to come to the peace table. And the Iranians say, yes, this was a significant thing, giving us this piece of antiquity back. Obama came out in very stark terms and criticized anybody who would dare question his decision to make peace with Iran, to enter into this ridiculous agreement that will supposedly stop the Iranians from becoming a nuclear power. It won't. It will only probably slow them down by a few weeks at most. There's a lot of controversy about what that agreement says. The foreign minister of Iran, Mohammad Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, had this to say following the thing. The question was, will Iran be allowed to enrich uranium? And here's his answer.
We believe that the current agreement, the current plan of action, as we call it, in two distinct places, has a very clear reference to the fact that Iranian enrichment program will continue and will be a part of any agreement, now and in the future.
Okay? And what does John Kerry say about whether they have a right to enrich uranium?
There also seems to be a clear difference between the United States and Iran on this issue of whether they have the right to enrich uranium. You say the deal does not include any recognition of that right. The foreign minister of Iran says it includes it in two distinct places. I just want to know, what is the U.S. position? Does the U.S. respect and recognize that right of Iran's? Yes or no?
No, there is no right to enrich. We do not recognize a right to enrich. It is clear in the NPT, in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's very, very clear that there is no right to enrich. But under the terms of this agreement, there will be a negotiation over whether or not they could have a very limited, completely verifiable, extraordinarily constrained program where they might have some medical research or other things they could do, but there is no inherent right to enrich. And everywhere in this particular agreement, it states that they could only do that by mutual agreement, and that nothing is agreed on until everything is agreed on. That language appears at least twice in significant places in this agreement. So there is no agreement that they can enrich. They have ability to negotiate it, but they could only gain that capacity to have some enrichment, as some countries do, if they live up to the whole set of terms necessary to prove it's a peaceful program.
Does that sound like there's a nice, good, rock-solid agreement in place, like the president comes out and castigates Benjamin Netanyahu for saying it's a bad deal? All Netanyahu did was listen to what the Iranians themselves were going back and saying. The Iranian foreign minister returned home to a hero's welcome in Tehran. And our president and our government has a much different agenda, and they are fitting themselves right into the bullseye of Bible prophecy by bringing Persia to a place of prominence and diminishing what has until recently been the world's last superpower. So who's right, the Iranian foreign minister or John Kerry? Caroline Glick, interviewed on the Stephen Maltzberg show the other day, gives what I think is the correct response.
There you go. Right off the bat, they signed the agreement, and each side has a different take on a very important part of the agreement.
No, I don't think that there's any contest here. John Kerry is lying, and the Iranian is telling the truth, because there are two places in the agreement that effectively recognize Iran's right to enrich uranium in contravention of 6 U.S.-sponsored, binding UN Security Council resolutions.
Okay, I think Caroline's right. Bret Stephens, writing in the Wall Street Journal, said, "This is worse than Munich." Remember Munich? Neville Chamberlain returning back saying, "I have an agreement with Herr Hitler." By the way, you'll notice that he did not refer to Hitler as the Fuhrer when he came back. At least he had the decency to do that. The EU leaders, the P5+1, this is the Paris peace talks, or Vietnam. How did that work out for the Vietnamese? And now Kerry and Obama coming back saying, we have an agreement with the leader of Iran. We have an agreement with the supreme leader. These people do not understand the enemy that we face, this enemy that I believe God has put in place for all of the end time scenarios to come about in His law. And I'm only saying that our government is not able to do this because the delusion that will come to full fruition after the church is out of here is in place and operative in the world today. I think at this point, there can be no question about that. So our leaders are deluded. In fact, there are times when I think they're actively working for a certain deed in the way they act. I don't think there's any question for that. Here's what Bret Stephens says. In each deal, talking about Chamberlain, Paris peace talks, whatever, and each deal was a prelude to worse. After Munich came the conquest of Czechoslovakia, the Nazi-Soviet pact, in World War II. After Paris came the fall of Saigon and Phnom Penh and the humiliating exit from the embassy rooftop. After Geneva, there will come a new chaotic Mideast reality in which the United States will lose leverage over enemies and friends alike. What will it look like? Iran will gradually shake free of sanctions and glide into a zone of nuclear ambiguity that will keep its adversaries guessing until it opts to make its capabilities known. Saudi Arabia will move swiftly to acquire a nuclear deterrent from its clients in Islamabad. Saudi billionaire Prince Alawi bin Talal made that clear to the Journal last week when he indiscreetly discussed the arrangement with Pakistan. Egypt is beginning to ponder a nuclear option of its own while drawing closer to a security alliance with Russia. As for Israel, it cannot afford to live in a neighborhood where Iran becomes nuclear, Assad remains in power, and Hezbollah, Israel's most immediate military threat, gains strength, clout, and battlefield experience. The chances that Israel will hazard a strike on Iran's nuclear sites greatly increased since Geneva. More so, the chances of another war with Hezbollah. After World War II, the U.S. created a global system of security alliances to prevent the kind of foreign policy freelancing that is again becoming rampant in the Middle East. It worked until President Obama decided in his wisdom to throw it away. If you hear echoes of the 1930s and the capitulation at Geneva, It's because the West is being led by the same sort of men, minus the umbrellas. Mark Stein, writing, said this: at Geneva, the participants came to the talks with different goals. The Americans and Europeans wanted an agreement, and the Iranians wanted nukes. Each party got what it came for. Mark Stein continues. This time around, the superpower and its allies, accounting for over 50% of the planet's military spending, were facing a militarily insignificant country with a ruined economy and no more than 2 to 3 months worth of hard currency, and they gave it everything it wanted. In fact, $8 billion was released this week to the Iranians, which they desperately needed. Israel and the Sunni monarchies, who comprise America's least worst friends in the Arab world, were kept in the dark about not only the contents of the first direct U.S.-Iranian talks in a third of a century, but even an acknowledgement that they were taking place. Certainly, Kerry has been unerringly wrong on every foreign policy issue for 4 decades, so sheer bungling stupidity cannot be ruled out. But look at it this way: it's been clear for some time that the U.S. was not going to take out Iran's nuclear facilities. That leaves only one other nation even minded to keep the option on the table: Israel. Hence the strange new romance between the Zionist entity and the Saudi and Gulf cabinet ministers, calling every night to urge them to get cracking. In the post-American world, you will find your friends where you can, even if they're Jews. But Obama and Kerry have not only taken a U.S. bombing raid off the table, they've ensured that any such raid by Israel will now come at a much steeper price. It's one thing to bomb a global pariah, quite another to bomb a semi-rehabilitated member of the international community in defiance of an agreement signed by the Big Five world powers. Indeed, this interested observer might easily conclude that the point of the plan seems to be to box in Israel rather than Iran. If it were to have that effect, the Sunni Arab states would have to be faced with the choice of accepting de facto Shia Persian hegemony. In other words, Persia, Iran, would control the oil in the Persian Gulf, 56% of the world's known reserves, or getting the Saudis to pay the Pakistanis for a Sunni bomb. Nobody in Araby believes that the U.S. can contain Iran even if it wants to, and since the Geneva deal, nobody's very sure the U.S. wants to. Meanwhile, through the many months they kept their allies in the dark, Washington was very obliging to the mullahs. According to the Times of Israel, among the Iranian prisoners quietly released by the U.S. as a friendly pre-deal gesture is Mojita Atarodi, arrested in 2011 for attempting to acquire nuclear materials. So we gave up a known terrorist to the largest known sponsor of terror on planet Earth today, and our government left an Iranian American citizen, who also is Iranian, pastor in one of the worst jails in Iran. And my understanding is Obama and Kerry never raised the issue at all with anyone. Folks, we live, can I be so bold? Yes. We live under an evil regime. God is judging America for what we have done, for abandoning God, abandoning Israel. And just like Israel in the Old Testament in the years leading up to the Babylonian captivity, and the prophets warning them of the coming judgment, we live at another time where God's judgment is coming again, and God is withdrawing his hand, and people are warning about it, but the government, the leaders, are unaware. And that operates in the political realm, it's operating in the economic realm. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it says this: "For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. Then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay," as the Antichrist, "will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. That is, the one whose coming is in accord with the activity of Satan, with all power and signs and false wonders, and with all deception of wickedness for those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth so as to be saved. For this reason, God will send upon them a deluding influence, so that they will believe what is false, in order that they all may be judged who did not believe the truth, but took pleasure in wickedness. And what I have said many times over the years is that this bucket filled with apostasy for the church or wickedness is going to be filling up, and at some point it's going to overflow and it'll come like a flood. But it's not going to go from totally empty to completely full overnight. It's right at the brim now. And it's just going to take a little push as God pulls back his hand for that bucket, if you will, to overflow and be a flood of judgment upon the world. And people need to be aware that that judgment is coming. As I've said many, many times, all of these lines of prophecy are converging all at the same time. And so the bucket, if you will, is almost full. And what's going to happen?
I've come here to Cairo to seek a new beginning between the United States and Muslims around the world. One based on mutual interest and mutual respect. And one based upon the truth that America and Islam are not exclusive and need not be in competition. Instead, they overlap and share common principles. Principles of justice and progress, tolerance, and the dignity of all human beings.
Are you kidding me? Islam and America, what America has stood for, are equivalent? Now, I want to say something. There are many people who dismiss the man in the picture as stupid, incapable, incompetent, whatever. This man laid out, at least with respect to Islam, what he was going to do in June of 2009. You need to go back and look at that speech and watch what happened. Watch what has happened in the years. Has he done anything to slow down or attempt to slow down the rise of great evil? No, he has not. He does not believe there is a difference. He is a leftist, and the leftism overwhelms any religion that he might have had. In the Jerusalem Post, writing, the columnist starts off with this, Into the Fray by Martin Sherman. It was in the Jerusalem Post on Friday. You can find it online. And he talked about the president's speech. And he said the president said that America and Islam share all these values. And this guy, if I can summarize, says, that's crazy. Listen to what he says. All one has to do is follow the daily news that routinely convey reports of the Habsburg horrors that flared across Syria, Libya, Egypt, and other Arab countries once the Leviathan cap of tyranny, in other words, the dictators that were in charge, holding these bestial impulses in check was uncorked. Worse, in some parts of the Muslim world, blood-curdling atrocities have become so commonplace, they hardly make the news at all. For when it comes to issues such as justice, progress, tolerance, and respect for societal and/or religious diversity, a yawning chasm divides America from Islam, I might add, or at least we used to think it did. Indeed, American society is a product of the values embodied in the Constitution and the Judeo-Christian values it draws on, and Islamic society is a product of Sharia, and the Muslim values it draws on are irreconcilably exclusive and antithetically opposed to one another. No amount of convoluted scholarly debate on the intricacies of Islamic scriptures or benign interpretation of their real significance can change the gruesome facts that prevail throughout Muslim-majority societies from West Africa to East Asia, and now I might add into Central Africa, into what was heretofore believed to be a Christian nation. One would be hard-pressed to find any area where they do in fact overlap and share common principles in any significant manner. His interpretation, Obama's interpretation of the international role the U.S. should play, the nature of the country's interests and the manner in which they should be pursued, his perception of friend and foe, and the attitudes that should be adopted towards them all seem to entail dramatic and disconcerting departure from that of most of his predecessors. In this regard, he is the first U.S. president who is explicitly and overtly unmoored, both cognitively and emotionally, from the bollards of America's founding Judeo-Christian heritage, and who somehow conceives that Islam is not inherently inimical to American values. Now, if I were asked how would anyone who is purposely aiming to undermine the Western world and bolster its antipodal adversaries behave, I would be compelled to respond much like Obama. It is difficult to understate the long-term ramifications of the Obama incumbency on what we have come to call the West. However, it is becoming increasingly apparent that it will emerge from the severely battered, its spirit emaciated, and its foundations fundamentally fractured.
Now, the second major source of tension that we need to discuss is the situation between Israelis, Palestinians, and the Arab world. America's strong bonds with Israel are well known. This bond is unbreakable. It is based upon cultural and historical ties and the recognition that the aspiration for a Jewish homeland is rooted in a tragic history that cannot be denied. Around the world, the Jewish people were persecuted for centuries, and anti-Semitism in Europe culminated in an unprecedented Holocaust. Tomorrow I will visit Buchenwald, which was part of a network of camps where Jews were enslaved, tortured, shot, and gassed to death by the Third Reich. 6 million Jews were killed, more than the entire Jewish population of Israel today. Denying that fact is baseless, it is ignorant, and it is hateful. Threatening Israel with destruction or repeating vile stereotypes about Jews is deeply wrong and only serves to evoke in the minds of Israelis this most painful of memories while preventing the peace that the people of this region deserve.
Jewish prophets predicted a time when, in the end, there would be yet one more Holocaust. If I could be so bold, that possibility is now greater than it has been at any time since Jesus returned to heaven. Set in place by this man. For others, we think to act on. But mark my words, it's coming. This man does not understand why the nation of Israel was founded again. First of all, it was a miracle of God. It was the hand of God, and it wasn't the result of the Holocaust. The Zionist movement was in place for well over 50 years before the Holocaust took place. Jews were returning, being drawn back by God, I believe, to the Holy Land for God's final plan with humanity to play out. But to say that the Holocaust was the reason for the founding of Israel is a misinterpretation of history. And then listen to what he does, though. The Holocaust, 6 million Jews were slaughtered, gassed, over 1 million children. I've been to the Yad Vashem a couple times. The Children's Memorial there will tear your heart out to think that man could do this type of genocide. It's indescribable. So we know what the Jews went through, but listen to what the president did in that speech in 2009 and what he says up as an equivalency.
On the other hand, it is also undeniable that the Palestinian people, Muslims and Christians, has suffered in pursuit of a homeland. For more than 60 years, they've endured the pain of dislocation. Many wait in refugee camps in the West Bank, Gaza, and neighboring.
Okay, I can't take any more of that. You can go listen to the speech. Those things are not equivalent. Only someone without a moral compass would make them equivalent. The Palestinians and the Israeli and the Jews. They are not equivalent in any stretch of the imagination, politically or historically. And only someone who's operating under, I believe, a deep, dark veil of deception could come to that conclusion and state it publicly. Caroline Glick, and we'll finish up with this part, writing this week, talked about this strange convergence of Thanksgiving and Hanukkah and the significance. Our column Friday titled Israel, the Pilgrims, and the Maccabees. Listen to what she says. I'm going to read a large portion of it because I think it's very profound. I think it has prophetic significance. I think it fits in with what the scriptures say will be going on in the end times. Back in October 2001, Ariel Sharon raised the hackles of the White House when he warned the United States, do not try to appease the Arabs at our expense. Sharon then invoked the 1938 Munich Pact. Don't repeat the terrible mistakes of 1938, when the enlightened democracies in Europe decided to sacrifice Czechoslovakia for a comfortable temporary solution. Israel, he said, will not be Czechoslovakia. Sharon was sharply rebuked not only by the White House. James Baker, one of the people in the White House, has a track record, the Bush White House, track record of not being a supporter of Israel, but by leading American supporters of Israel. They attacked him for daring to make the comparison. In time, with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, Sharon's warning was largely forgotten. While Bush's legacy remains uncertain, what is absolutely certain is that his successor, Barack Obama, is seeking to appease the Iranians and other Islamist forces at Israel's expense. The appeasement Sharon accused Bush of contemplating has become the official policy of the U.S. government. And she alluded back to Chamberlain and what Chamberlain did with the Fuhrer, with Hitler, and the agreement that was made. And the problem, she says, with the Munich Pact was that it empowered Hitler and so paved the way for the German invasion of Poland a year later. That invasion in turn paved the way for the Holocaust and for the death of 60 million people in World War II. Those, like Winston Churchill and Zev Jabotinsky, who foresaw these events, were castigated as extremists and warmongers. Those who ignored their warnings were celebrated as peacemakers who boldly chose peace over war. In case you don't know who Zev Jabotinsky was, Zev Jabotinsky was a Zionist, and he died about 1940, and he gave some very fiery speeches, and he believed in a greater Israel. And I believe Caroline Glick has a new book coming out. It's going to be about a one-state solution. It'll be very controversial. She said when we saw her speak in July that it should be out early this next year. I wish it would come out now because I think the world really needs it. But the greater Israel that Jabotinsky foresaw was an Israel that existed from down into Saudi Arabia, to the Nile River on the west, to the Euphrates River on the east, and up past the mountains of Lebanon in the north. In other words, Jabotinsky believed that the prophecy or the promise, the covenant that God made with the people of Israel of their land from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates would be fulfilled. Now, it hasn't yet. It will be when the king returns, but you can see how far we've gone from people like Jabotinsky. In fact, I believe that Jabotinsky, cannot remember the name of, there was an organization that took up Jabotinsky's belief, and they attacked and killed the British so that Israel could take back the land. One of the people that was involved in that movement was a husband and wife who have a daughter. Her name is Tzipi Livni. Tzipi Livni has really departed from where her parents were. Parents were very close associates with Menachem Begin. Irgun movement, I think is what it was called. They were called terrorists. They were very Zionist. They wanted Israel to control Israel. So they took the fight to the people that were occupying, much the way I would submit to you that the people under Joshua took the fight to the Canaanites when they came back from the Holy Land. And all this plays into where I'm going to be going with the Maccabees mostly next week. But, so those who ignored their warning were celebrated as peacemakers who boldly chose peace over war. So too today, Israel is castigated by Obama and his supporters in Washington, Europe, and the media as a warmonger for realistically foreseeing the consequences of last weekend's nuclear deal with Iran. Even worse, they are portraying Israel as a rogue state that will be subject to punishment if it dares to militarily strike Iran's nuclear installations. In other words, rather than threatening Iran, the leading state sponsor of terrorism, led by a regime that is pursuing an illicit nuclear weapons program while threatening Israel with annihilation, with military strikes if it refuses to cease and desist from building nuclear weapons, the world powers are threatening Israel. British Foreign Minister William Hague made his projection of Iranian criminality onto its intended victim, the explicit policy of the world powers on Monday during his appearance before the British Parliament, in which he said this.
Of course, we would discourage anybody in the world, including Israel, from taking any steps that would undermine this agreement, and we will make that very clear to all concerned. It's also very important to explain to them, to ask them, what the alternative to this agreement would be, because the alternatives would involve Iran getting to nuclear weapons threshold capability, or having a nuclear weapon, or a conflict with Iran, or all of those.
In other words, Caroline says, as Hague, Obama, and Secretary of State John Kerry see things, Iran needs to be protected from Israel. The agreement that Britain and the U.S. heroically defend from the threat of Israeli aggression guarantees that Iran will develop nuclear weapons. Like the Munich Pact's empowerment of Hitler 75 years ago, the Geneva Agreement's empowerment of Iran's Ayatollahs guarantees that the world will descend into an unspeakable conflagration. And this is far from the only step that they are taking to weaken Israel. As the EU weakens its economic sanctions against the world's leading sponsor of terrorism, it is ratcheting up its economic sanctions against Israel, the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. The goal of these sanctions is to coerce Israel into surrendering its historic heartland and ability to defend itself to Palestinian terrorists sworn to its destruction. And there you saw, just this week, Israel will not take certain science funds to use in the settlements because it might offend the sensibilities of the European Union. We also found out this week, this is a headline from the Gulf News this morning, that Europe envoys have been making secret trips, discreet trips to Damascus, another state sponsor of terrorism. And Israel was invited to join the UN's Western Nations Group. This is the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Now, why is that significant? Israel's not in Europe. Israel's in Asia. The Asian countries, largely Islamic, refused to allow Israel to participate at the UN Human Rights Council because it would somehow contaminate the process, because they're Jews. The Bible prophesied, my friends, that in the end times the Jews would be hated. And now, a country that's been one of their best friends, at least its leadership, its blind, godless leadership, is taking formally friend of Israel down a very dark path. But I want you to see that it says that in the end, the prophet said, all nations will be aligned against Israel in the end times. All nations. Israel's the problem. The 6 million Jews that live in Israel are the problem. The 12 million that live around the world are the problem for all of humanity's problems. It is insane to those who can see the truth. it is understandable if you keep in mind that this delusion will operate on many, many levels in the end times. Keep that in mind. It will help make sense of the news. It will help you understand a world that appears to have gone mad. God laid it all out in advance for us to understand. If we study the scriptures, look at what's going to happen, all of these alliances, problems, all these things are laid out in scripture. Now, there's still a lot to be fulfilled, okay? I'm just saying as the stage is being set, everything is being set up for a very rapid fulfillment. And when Jesus said, "Behold, I come quickly," he meant when things leading up to my return start to happen, they're going to happen really fast. It's going to be like the pictures I've used of the tsunami, where people are, the tsunami, the water drains out of the ocean, and people go, "Oh, look at the pretty reefs." We have to usually snorkel out here to do that. Aren't those pretty? What's that white thing coming on the horizon? And the end times will flow over them like a flood. Caroline continues, for its part, the Obama administration is expected to massively increase its pressure on Israel to make concessions to the PLO that, if undertaken, will similarly threaten Israel's viability militarily, legally, and politically. Obama has promised that if Israel and the PLO are unable to reach an accord by January, he will present his own formulation and seek to coerce Israel into implementing it. Given Obama's stated position on the Palestinians' conflict with Israel, it is clear that his formulation will involve the surrender of eastern, southern, and northern Jerusalem, as well as the surrender of Judea and Samaria and the forced expulsion of more than 500,000 Jews from their homes to enable the surrender of these areas Jew-free. There is no similar provision going the other way to make the Israeli-controlled areas Palestinian-free. And so this biblical heartland, Judea and Samaria, is going to be turned back over to the Palestinians. Give me a few more minutes here. And that is not all. Obama is also expected in the next several months to place Israel's purported nuclear arsenal on the international chopping block. Since entering office, he has already taken steps in this direction. Now in his rush to transform Israel into the new Iran and Iran into the new Israel, the prospect that Obama will expose Israel's nuclear secrets as a means to enable Iran's completion of its nuclear weapons program cannot be disregarded. In other words, the weakened deal with Iran is not the end of a process of attempting to enfeeble Israel. It is the beginning of that process. The worst is still very much before us. It is a fortuitous coincidence that this challenging era in the history of Israel, certainly the most challenging diplomatic period since the establishment of the Jewish state 65 years ago, began the week of Thanksgiving. It is even more fortuitous that in these frightening moments, the most American of festivals took place during Hanukkah, the most Jewish of festivals. These two festivals have rarely, if ever, been celebrated at the same time, are similar in key respects. Thanksgiving is not simply about a voyage of religious freedom seekers from Europe to America. The story of the Pilgrims is not remembered simply because they landed in the New World. The Pilgrims are celebrated because they comported themselves upon arrival. In the 3 months after their initial landing, half of the Pilgrims died from disease and murder at the hands of the native tribes. Those who survived suffered from unspeakable privations. Yet in 3 months, they managed through their sufferings to establish the first modern democracy and to build a settlement. Their faith-grounded heroic tenacity is the reason that a small band of religious rebels formed the cultural basis for the United States of America when it was founded 155 years later. It was that heroism that led Abraham Lincoln to declare Thanksgiving a national holiday during the darkest hour of the Civil War, when the image of the Pilgrims empowered the Union soldiers fighting for a new birth of freedom. As for Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights is a celebration of Jewish religious freedom and national liberation. The Maccabees freed the Jews from the tyranny of Greece, the world's greatest superpower, which denied them their right to remain Jewish. The Maccabees, a small band of heroically tenacious Jews who suffered extraordinary hardship in their war against the far superior Greek forces, took strength and comfort in their faith. It was their faith in God that empowered them to face impossible odds and emerge victorious. It was their faith in God that gave them the ability to stand up not only to the Greeks, but to the Jewish elites who preached submission and appeasement as the better part of virtue, castigating them as warmongering zealots for refusing to bow before false gods. The faith of the Pilgrims and the faith of the Maccabees was the faith of free men. It was the faith that formed the foundations of the United States. It is the faith that has enabled the Jews to survive 4,000 years. It is the faith that enabled the Jews to do the impossible and rebuild our homeland after 2,000 years of exile and unspeakable persecution. Boy, I sure love the way she writes. It is this foundational faith that made the American people feel a natural kinship with the Jewish people. And it is this foundational faith that has brought the people of Israel to love America. This bond, based on the best of both from people, persists today, even as Obama and his fellow appeasers push America on the path their founding fathers rejected when they came to the New World. Both the Israelis and the Americans must take heart from this week when we commemorate the heroic heritage of free men and women. With the providence of God, we will be the loyal children of the Maccabees and the Pilgrims, and we will merit their legacy. Thanksgiving and Hanukkah teach us that when we rely on our faith in God, we can surmount impossible challenges. Israel has the means, limited though they may be, to meet the extraordinary tests we face today, as the leaders of America have turned on us by turning on the shared heritage of faith and fortitude of our nations. Wow. I pray for Caroline. Speaking boldly like this will sometime in the very near future come at a very extreme cost. So pray for her salvation, pray for her protection. Pray for the nation of Israel, who is under assault, as she said, unlike any time in the last 65 years. Now look, you need to understand what was going on. She mentioned the elites. I'll talk more about this next week, but understand that when we in our Western Hellenistic Greco-Roman mind think about Bible prophecy, we think, oh, here's a prophecy, and then this happened, and the prophecy has been fulfilled. That's not the way the Jews looked at Bible prophecy. They looked at prophecy as a pattern that would recapitulate or repeat itself over and over again. So understand that the Maccabees, the issue of the Maccabees, we'll talk more about this next week, was really similar to the Exodus. God called his people out of Egypt. Egypt being a symbol of the world, God called his people out of there, took them out miraculously and protected them. There were things going on in Egypt that were very similar to what will happen in the end times. Because you remember Moses went in there and he did miracles. But what happened? Janus and Jambres, they duplicated the miracles. I believe those miracles were real. In the end times, there will be an antichrist possessed by Satan and a false prophet that will duplicate miracles, lying signs and wonders, to get people off track of what the truth is. So understand that the pattern of what happened in Egypt in the Exodus is a pattern that happened at the time of the Maccabees in 168 to 165 BC, when Antiochus Epiphanes came down. And bit by bit, what he did, he stopped sacrifices, he stopped the reading of the Torah in public and that type of thing. So what did the Jews at the time do? Well, they made compromises. Okay, well, we won't read the Torah, we'll just read the prophets and try to figure out what the Torah, help people figure out what the Torah said. And so they compromised with the dominant culture at the time. They compromised with the political leadership, the politics of the region at the time. And what happened, eventually they lost all of their religious freedom. That pattern, my friends, is going to be repeated in the end times. This pattern happened when God took his people out of Egypt before the Babylonian captivity. There was this compromise. The leadership, the religious leaders, were compromised spiritually. So we should expect that when we get to the end times, when God is going to fulfill the ultimate Exodus and take us all out of here out of Egypt, the world in the rapture, that the same things that were happening in Egypt will happen in the end times. The same things that will happen before the Babylonian captivity will happen in the end times. The same things that happened before the Assyrians came in the end time. And people will see things that happen. For example, I'm sure that when Assyria fell, people thought, oh, glad that's over with. We don't have to worry about them anymore. Just like we did 25 years ago now, when the Soviet Union fell. Oh, well, now we have peace for our time. We don't have to worry about anything. So is the world better now than it was in 1989? Is it more peaceful now than it was in 1989? No. So what happens is, this was bad, the next one's worse. And the worst one of all is coming, and it appears to be on our very near horizon. So I talk about it all the time. I'm thoroughly convinced that we're very close. How close, I don't know. Could it be 5, 6, 7, 10? I really don't know. I'm just telling you that everything is there. Everything is there for everything to wrap up. And so what happened at the time of the Maccabees, we need to be aware of. And so what you see is this compromise of leadership. So you have different people. This article appeared I just happened to see it in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. In Israel, a dream made real. And this is a person writing for Haaretz, which is a left-wing newspaper in Israel. And he says this: in Israel, the Jewish Renaissance was achieved by the remarkable success of Zionism. When Zionism was launched in 1897, approximately 50,000 Jews lived in the Holy Land. Now the Jewish population exceeds 6 million. In 1897, Jews living in Palestine represented only 4.4% of world Jewry. In 1950, we accounted for 10.6%. In 1980, 25.6%. Now we make up almost 45%. Today, the Jewish community in Israel is one of the 2 largest in the world. Given current trends, by 2025, the majority of the world's Jews will be Israelis. The fundamental Zionist diagnosis and prognosis proved to be correct. Israel is not the utopia it set out to be. It is flawed and maimed in many ways. It denies the Palestinians their rights and often betrays its own citizens. It has an unworthy political leadership, a dysfunctional political system, and an unjust socioeconomic structure. You can see the leftism coming through in that part. Yet Israel is an amazing expression of vitality, of success against all odds. Once one steps back from the ongoing friction of a conflict reported daily around the world, one can see the transformation of the Jews in the Zionist century. We have had to come here, and once we came, we did wonders. The Jewish nation state has brought neither peace nor peace of mind to the Jews, but it has provided us with the intensity of life on the edge, the adrenaline rush of living dangerously. Threatened with death, we have built a spectacle of life. We have converged on this shore and cling to this shore, come what may. He concludes. And so there is this tension between different factions, shall we say, the elites, like Zippy Livni, who want to compromise, the Maccabee types like Caroline Glick, who don't. It is even in the church, conferences like David Hawkins at Chino Hills that supports Israel, Christ at the Checkpoint Conference, which does not. And so you see this push. Everybody wants this to happen. So look, I need to stop because we're way over time. It's the time that the message of Jesus' first coming that Peter preached about so wonderfully, first hour, needs to be declared to the world again, because Jesus' second coming appears to be at hand. And it's time to share the gospel. It's time to live our lives wholly prepared for Jesus' soon return. So next week we'll take more look at the Festival of Dedication, or really the Festival of Rededication, and some of the things that I have at least an hour already to go for next week. So we're going to try to pare it down. But I think this festival and the timing of it is providential. So let's leave here this week, our mind and heart set on Christ and the soon return, and live our lives in light of that. you're dismissed. Thank you.